So yeah, we start with the talk what's new in Symfony 5.3. And Marco already mentioned that. This is we. It's Marco and Malte. They both work for QOSSMIC, but I think most of you know that. And it's myself, Jan. And at the moment I work for Siemens here in Aveiro, Portugal. What do we want to talk about? Of course, not only the new things coming with Symfony 5.3, we also want to show you some deprecations which we think are important to know and to fix to be able to upgrade later easily to version 6. But before we go into detail, let's talk about the roadmap of Symfony again. You can see, no, one second, no, okay, it's important. You can see that Symfony always comes with 4 minor versions before a new major version is released. And we are now talking about Symfony 5.3. So this is the last minor version before the before 5.4. And every 0.4 version is always an LTS version, a long-time support version. And you can also see here, this was changed in Symfony version 5, that the maintenance, the time period for a non-LTS release maintenance period was reduced. It's only 6 months now, and you will only get 6 months of bug and security fixes in the 5.3 release. Okay, so let's start with the deprecations. It's important to know that all this affected code here we will show you needs to be changed to be able to upgrade to Symfony 6. And the recommendation is always to do that as soon as possible. So if you upgrade to Symfony 5.3, also plan to remove the deprecations. And there are a lot. We won't show all of them, it's too much. So we just shows the, we think, most important ones. And the first one here is the renaming of the master request to the main request. There was a big discussion some months ago about removing words connected to slavery. And a lot of companies and also projects on GitHub, for example, decided to rename their branches, their master branches to something else. And GitHub also decided to rename the master branch to main. Symfony did that already in the last version or 2 versions ago. There is no master branch anymore. It's now called 5.x. And yeah, and now the main request was also, the master request was also renamed to main. And this, of course, affects some places in Symfony, and these 3 places you can see here. So you should make sure if you, for example, use the kernel event is main request in your event listeners or subscribers, need to change that to be able to update to Symfony 6. The next thing, next deprecation in the framework bundle is the deprecated SessionInterface alias. So it's not able to use the session service and auto-wire it in one of your services anymore. You should use the request deck if you want to access the session. Or if you're on a controller, you can access the session via the get session method from the request itself. Next thing in the form component was the removal of the Symfony Intel dependency. So in case you use one of these types shown here, you now need to run composer require Symfony Intel to be still able to use them. So this is not a real deprecation. If you use one of these types, you really need to require this Intel dependency, otherwise your code will fail. And this is already the last deprecation we would like to show here. It's regarding the Redis Bridge for the messenger component. Before Symfony 5.3, it was possible to add an option TLS and set it to true in case you wanted to talk to Redis in a secure way. This was changed now, and you can use a proper scheme to do that. So the important thing is the additional S here, Redis S, for the secure connection to a Redis server. There are some more. It was not all of them. So if you're interested, please have a look on this page. You will find all the deprecations there as well. Okay, let's talk about improvements. And the first thing, it's quite a big part. You already know in Symfony 5.3 was the Symfony PHP 8 support introduced. And with PHP 8 support also came some attributes for the root, for example, or to configure a root or to configure validation constraints. It's also for the serializer component where some attributes introduced you could use. In Symfony 5.3 now, we have more attributes. And I will just show you some of them now. I think you know that auto-wire arguments in a controller action is something you probably use every day. This is just a regular Symfony controller with an invoke method and a service injected as an action argument. This is possible if you tag your controllers with the controller service arguments tag. So there is some manual work involved to be able to use this feature. If you now use Symfony 5.3, it's a little bit easier. You don't have to adjust your service YAML anymore. You can now use the asController attribute. But in the end, it will do the same in the background. It will tag your controller and your services can be injected in your actions methods. This is an event subscriber, like you probably also have in your application. It implements the event subscriber interface, which then leads to implementing get subscribed events method. And you afterwards need to implement your listener method. Right? And with auto-configure set to true in your service YAML, this listener will get auto-configured by default. So it will get tagged by default and the event dispatcher knows it and can then execute your listener function if you dispatch the custom event. This is also easier now in Symfony 5.3. You have an attribute for that, the event listener attribute, where you can configure your event and your listener method and also a priority. And there is no need to implement the event subscriber interface anymore. And in the end, this listener will get tagged automatically, and the event dispatcher knows it, and everything works like before. This is a regular Symfony 5.2 command where you define the default name and the default description, and also set some aliases or configure if this command should be hidden or not. And in Symfony 5.3, this is also possible with an attribute. Right? The command attribute can be used to configure the same things you just saw. So this will lead to much shorter commands and looks nicer in my opinion. The next thing is when attribute is something you can use to define if some service or some configured service should be available in a specific environment. So here, for example, you see that this command is only registered for, only configured for the dev environment. So in case you use this command in a prod environment, you won't be able to use it because it's not configured there. There is another feature which you can use in a YAML component, but I think Malte will talk about that later. So the next thing related to attributes is auto-configuring services, which is now also easier with attributes. I just explained that when we talked about the command and event listeners. If you set auto-configure to true, right, it will automatically tag some of your services. So the Symfony service container will see that you implement, for example, the event subscriber interface, and will then automatically tag your event listener with the specific tag. And your event the Symfony event special will then know your listener. You can also do this for your custom services in your application with the instance of option. Why do we just define the interface and then you add a tag there? If you want to do this not in your service YAML, you can do this in your kernel as well with the register for auto configuration method. Or if you work in a bundle, can do this in the load method of the bundle extension. And this is also Symfony 5.2, so this is how it worked before. And in Symfony 5.3, we now have the possibility to do all of that with one PHP 8 attribute, which looks like this. So you can save all these YAML configurations and also these kernel adjustments and extension adjustments with just adding this attribute here. And in the background, the same happens. And of course, you can't only add tags, you can also add all other things, or you can call all other things which were possible with the auto register for auto configuration method. Then there's one attribute extending the auto configure attribute. This is the auto configure tag attribute. And this is just a convenient way to tag services. So you can see here, you can call it with a specific tag name if you want to. And if you leave out the tag name, then the fully qualified class name of your interface or of your base class will then be used as a tag name. So if we now tag some services, of course, we also want to inject these services. Right? And usually in Symfony 5. Or earlier, before Symfony 5.3, you used tag iterator or tag locator. You had to configure it in your service YAML, but for that we also have a tag. We have attribute now, so there is no need to adjust your service YAML anymore. You can use this tag iterator attribute to define which tag services should be injected in these loaders argument here. And then you might ask, okay, but what about the priority? What about the index if I have a locator? Yeah, of course, there's an attribute as well. So you can use your LVS tagged item attribute, define the index and the priority, and just apply that to the implementation of, for example, here, loader interface, which means now, okay, this YAML loader is tagged with the priority of 10 and with the index YAML loader. And we have an XML loader here, which has the priority of 20 now. And they will, of course, based on the priority, inject it here in a specific order in this loader iterator. Or if you have a locator, you can access these services by using the index names. So there's much less configuration needed for injecting tagged services in your custom services, which I actually quite like. Okay, that's what it was about attributes. I still have some more slides before Marco will take over. This one is about the form component. Just imagine you want to have a form like this with a company field, the first name and the last name, and of course some kind of button to register here in this case. But the company is not always shown. The company is shown based on some criteria, for example. So this could be a person registration type, a form type. You can see first name, last name is always there. Our register button is also there. But in case we have a legal entity, so we don't have a real person, we have something else, we want to show the company name field. So we usually use a form event for that. And what happens then, our company field is added at the end of our form, right? After all other fields which were already rendered. So, but this is the wrong place. We wanted to show the company field in front of all other fields, so on top of them. And before Symfony 5.3, this was only possible if you adjust, if you add your fields to the templates by using the form field names. So if you just want to render the form dynamically without placing the fields manually, this was not possible. But now you can add a priority to your form fields. If you add a specific form field via the builder, you can now add a priority option, which then leads to the correct order in your shown form. The notifier component is not experimental anymore. It was experimental for 2 versions, 3 versions, I think, but it's not anymore. So it's marked as stable. We have some new integrations. So we have some new texture transports and shader transports. And I don't want to show you all of them, but 2 are important, in my opinion. So the FakeSms and FakeChat transports. And you can use them in development, and they will send your SMS or your chat messages via mailer. So it's really convenient in the development environment to check if your notifications got sent out correctly. So the serializer got a new annotation, or if you work in PHP 8, a new attribute. It's now possible to define the context on a property basis. Right? You don't need to implement a custom normalizer or add a custom context to the serialize method call. You can now do that directly on the attribute if you want to. And there are several options possible, like the normalization context, the normalization context, or even groups. And the next thing is the Redis Bridge. There were some new things added. This is the first one. New form theme is now available. The Tailwind CSS form theme. This is still experimental, but I think it's already it's ready to be used and to be tried out. Then next thing is before Symfony 5.3, it was not possible to extract concatenated translations out of templates. This was fixed now. So if you run the translation update command, you are now also able to extract concatenated strings or concatenated translations. And then we have a new filter, the serialized filter, which you can use in a template to serialize some object into a specific format. So it's calling the serializer in the background. And this is convenient if you, for example, use this new Symfony Stimulus bridge and want to call a controller there, because these controllers expect JSON, for example. And then you can serialize your object directly in the template. Don't have to do that in the controller anymore. So I think that was my part, and Marco will take over, I think.
Yes. You guys see my slides? Yep, I think that's true. Cool. Awesome. So as we all have probably heard, starting from Symfony 6, the PHP configuration format will be the recommended format to use. That does not mean that XML or YAML won't be supported. They will. They're still first-class configuration formats, but Symfony will recommend the use of PHP and will use PHP themselves as much as possible. But right now, the way you write configuration for a bundle, it's basically just a deserialized version of the YAML config. It doesn't use the full potential of writing PHP code. And so with PHP 5.3, we now have a more semantic way of writing that. And now it has auto-completion, and it's basically, it's a lot nicer to use, a lot more developer-friendly. Moving on to the file system component, for a long time, Symfony, the remove method on the file system object has been problematic sometimes, especially with file systems that have a throttled disk I/O. So, for example, a distributed file system like cluster FS, and this method is susceptible to race conditions, which means that, or more specifically, if you have a folder you want to delete, call this method 100 times at the same time, it's not going to end well. And starting with 5.3, that's now been fixed. The fix is relatively simple. The files, the folder's just renamed, and then afterwards it gets deleted. So now, if you call this method 100 times, if all goes well, 1 will succeed and 99 will fail if not found. So yeah. And rate limiters, the rate limiter component is a relatively new component in the Symfony ecosystem, and it's also one that by nature is susceptible to race conditions as well, since it has to store the information on the number of tokens in this, or the tokens is the right terminology, the number of times basically something was accessed, and has to store that information in cache, and then has to fetch that information, make a decision, and then save the new count. But then after it decides to process a request, and before it saves the new count, there's still the small window that another request can slip through. And which is why by default, it uses the standard lock that you have set up. And what people realized at some point was that it's great that it does that, but it's actually not that important in 90% of use cases. In 90% of use cases, you don't really care if you have a limit of 100, if 101 requests pop through, or 102. And also it adds a lot of load to the backend that you use for storing that information. And so Symfony 5.3 allows you to not use a lock, first of all, and second of all, makes that actually the default option. So that, if all this time you've relied on just the default lock being used, and you really need a lock for some reason, for legal reasons maybe, then be sure to specify the lock using the lock factory option that we have in the configuration. And another component that has a lot of new things, or has had a lot of new things in store for us past releases, is security. As most of you know, since Symfony 5.1 landed with a brand new authentication system, the old one still works, but it's deprecated and will be removed in Symfony 6. So just a quick recap on what the changes actually were. In the past, we had a more convoluted system with firewall listeners. You would have one firewall listener per authentication method, which means you could have multiple firewall listeners per firewall, and implementing your own custom authentication logic meant that you had to implement a firewall listener and authentication provider. And this was a really error-prone process. And you can even see minor inconsistencies within Symfony's own authentication providers. And that's why with Symfony 2.8, Guard was introduced, and that worked really well. It was well received by the community, and it made implementing your own authentication scheme a lot easier. So basically, we took what was good, which was Guard, and removed everything else, and built a new system around Guard, or at least the next evolution of Guard. And the security component also now uses an event-driven system, so very much like the HTTP kernel. The security system basically fires a bunch of events, and even the core logic, the built-in logic, they just consist of listeners that listen on those events, and that really lends you a lot more flexibility in terms of what can be done before, during, and after authentication. For example, we have a password upgrade feature that you don't really need to change anything within the security system itself. You could do that purely using event listeners and passport badges, which we'll get to in a moment. So it's really powerful, really flexible. And guards are now called authenticators and are a little bit different. Core concept is still the same. You know, the important parts of your authentication, your own authentication logic in one spot, just a few minor API changes to make it work a bit better. And unauthenticated tokens are now called passports. And they're also a little bit different. A really new addition is the concept of badges, which are basically data that's stored on the passports. Now that's really generic. That's because it could be anything. It's basically data that is somehow relevant to your authentication process that you can add. For example, do you want to let people upgrade their passwords automatically? Add the password upgrade badge, and there will be a listener that checks for that. So really, really flexible, really cool. And now on to the changes. So with Symfony 5.3, we now have the ability to specify mandatory password badges at the application level. Now this is it's more of a security precaution, because if you didn't specify at an application level, hey, I need this definitely, then you could potentially have third-party authenticators that could just remove stuff, and you wouldn't even notice, you know, at the end of the day. This expects a fully qualified class name. If you don't specify a fully qualified class name, it assumes that the class is defined in this namespace here above. And yeah, it's a pretty useful feature. Another really useful feature that I'm really happy about, I could have used this so many times in previous projects, is the debug firewall command. And I think we've all been in that situation where we change something in some complex area like security, and we think we did it correctly. It still doesn't work, and we don't know why. And now we can actually better diagnose these problems and, you know, ask your application, hey, what do you think I wrote? And debug firewall gives you a list of the firewalls in your application. To view specific details of a firewall, you specify the firewall name and you get a bunch of details. The output is really, really long. I had to truncate it, but yeah, it's extremely detailed, really cool. And with Symfony 5.3, actually Symfony 5.2 added the ability to use magic login links. I think a lot of us know that from, say, Medium or Slack, where to log in, you type in your email and then you get an email, you click on the link and you're logged in like magic. And Symfony 5.2 has support for that. The only thing is, if you have an internationalized application, then with the implementation that Symfony 5.2 brings, there was really no possibility to say, okay, this user is a German speaker. Please send this person to the German speaking to the German page after login. And now we have the ability to do that. Basically a second parameter is added to create login link, which is the request, and the request context from that request is used in the generation of the URL. So if the request context says that the locale is DE, then that is also used by the URL generator. Now, starting with Symfony 5.3, CSRF tokens will be masked, and this will help protect us. It's a precaution against breach. So this, just a quick recap of how it works right now. CSRF tokens are basically per form only. So they're not shared between forms. Each form has its own CSRF token. But that CSRF token used for each form is reused across requests. So if you have a page with a form on it, it has the CSRF token, and you reload that page, you will see the exact same CSRF token there. Which if the response that is being sent back makes use of HTTP compression. So, for example, if the response body is gzipped, and if an attacker has the ability to inject their own data into the response, like a search, like if it's a search field, or like you can type in your own words and then it appears on the page, then you're probably susceptible to breach. And in a nutshell, breach is all about being able to guess the contents of an encrypted page by comparing the sizes of compressed pages. It's basically a side channel attack that, because of the way compression works, if you are able to enter a string or a string that is similar or that's the same as a part of a secret or whatever content, then you'll really notice that the page is just that little bit smaller because of the way encryption works, because of the way compression works, right? If you have an array of bytes somewhere that gets repeated in multiple places, then the compression algorithm makes sure it's only available in one place and it's just referenced. So that property can be used to basically brute force and guess secrets that are on pages. And of course, the solution to that is just to make sure that the CSRF token does not look the same. We could either go with a nonce and basically use CSRF tokens only once per request, or the solution that was taken here was to basically randomize the representation so that the CSRF token looks different. It's not different, it's the same. There's no change in logic, but it just looks different every time. And yeah, so the implementation is pretty interesting. I highly recommend you guys check it out. And moving on to the UID component, which as of 5.3 is no longer experimental, and which means that we can expect the API to be more stable going forward. And to that end, there are a number of new things to show. First of all, the factory methods that we have. If you already have a UID that is in some kind of representation, then you can create you can instantiate an object using that as well. Now it's also possible to generate UIDs via the CLI. It happens to me quite often that I just need a random UID, and I usually go to Google, I type UUID generator, click on the first result, but now I can do that in the CLI. I don't need my internet connection. It's really cool. Important to keep in mind that this is not activated by default. You have to register the services first. So you need to add these 5 lines in your services.yaml to register the commands, and then you can use them. And Symfony 5.3 also comes with a bunch of improvements in the integration between the UID component and other components in the ecosystem, the first of which are forms. So now Symfony 5.3 comes with form types for UUID and ULID. And the cool thing is that that takes care of basically data transformations. It converts the UID object into a string when the form is being rendered, and when input is being processed, it converts the string back to the UID object. That's super convenient. The other integration that was improved was the one with the serializer. Symfony 5.3 now comes with the ability to specify the normalization format that you would like to have. So basically, if you have a large object and a bunch of UIDs inside that, before it would only show up in the canonical representation. You couldn't really say, I want it in base 58 or whatever, and now you can. So yeah, that's really helpful. It really spares you from having to write a lot of custom code. And now Malte will take over. Are you ready, Malte?
Yes.
Cool.
Cool. Thank you, Marco. I think now you see the new page. Correct. Perfect. Yeah. In some console comments, it's common to define 2 related options with opposite behaviors. For example, the default options applied to all Symfony commands include the ANSI and no ANSI options. In Symfony 5.3, are negligible comment options added to simplify these commands. A single negligible option creates 2 options in the command, following the pattern minus minus something and minus minus no minus something. In practice, the following is equivalent to the previous configuration. So if you run the command without any options, the use ANSI variable will be null. If you run the command with the ANSI option, the variable will be true. And on the opposite, if you run the command with the no ANSI option, the variable will be false. And I think the most of you knows the helpful YAML linter of Symfony and GitHub Actions. And I think both are very cool, but in my opinion, they are in combination a little bit annoying if the linter fails, because you don't see directly on the summary page what the problem is. To see the problem, you have to do some unnecessary clicks to visit your job detail page to see the console output and what the problem is. In Symfony 5.3, the YAML linter supports now the GitHub annotations like PHP stamp. So if your job fails, you get the details directly on the summary page and saves you some lifetime, I think. Or if you look on the diff page of a file, you will see the annotation of the failed YAML linter also inline of the code. Currently, only the YAML linter supports GitHub annotations. For the other linters, like the twig linter, is still an open issue left. If you're using the PHP configuration for services or for bundle configuration, there's also a remove method now added. So it's especially useful in the configure container method of the kernel or in a service configuration. So it allows to not use a compiler path to remove some services, for instance, in a test mode. Sometimes it's very difficult to write or read complex environment variables, like in the configuration of the foo service with many environment variables processors. And if you're using the PHP, if you're using PHP for configuration, can now use the end method, like in the configuration of the bar service. It provides autocomplete to write it easy, and at the end, I think it's much clearer to read. Yeah, sometimes it's necessary to get the opposite of a Boolean variable, like you have an app debug environment variable, and you want to get the negative or the opposite value. Can now use the not processor to negate the Boolean variable. For example, you have the environment variable true and var with true as the value, and you are using the not processor, and it will be processed as false in the container. So the recommended way of processing Symfony forms is to use a single action for rendering the form and handling the form submit. This is how it looks like in practice when using libraries such as Symfony UX Turbo, because you have to follow the HTTP protocol strictly. For example, if the form is submitted but invalid, the response must have a 522 status code. In order to simplify the form handling in those cases, Symfony 5.3 adds a new optional helper to render forms. This helper is defined in the abstract controller as a new method called renderForm. This method renders a given form and sets the 422 status code when the form is submitted and invalid. Internally, it calls the form create view, so it's not necessary to do it in the controller. And you can use it normally like the render or render view method. So this is a little under the hood change, but I think it's interesting for people who clear the cache pool programmatically, like in a CI pipeline. In Symfony 5.2 and earlier was the command cache pool clear always successful in the output and had the return code 0 even if a cache pool could not be cleared. In Symfony 5.3, the command will fail if a cache pool could not be cleared because its return code will be 1, and I think it's much easier to see it output clear warning. Symfony defines different configuration environments, so you can change your application behavior depending on where it's run. The options apply to bundles or packages, and all environments are defined in config/packages, and the specific options of each environment are defined in config/packages/the environment like prod or test. This works well, but it's cumbersome when the differences among environments are minimal, because you need to create or maintain another config file just to change a few config options. That's why in Symfony 5.3, you can also define options for different environments in a single file. The exact syntax to the use depends on the format of the config file. As Jan mentioned, you can use it as a PHP attribute, or in YAML config files, use a special key when add with the environment as a suffix like when add dev. So in the example, the service, some service for dev will only be available in the dev environment. Or if you're using the XML config, perhaps the config you already have with the new when tag and define the desired environment as an attribute on the when tag. And in PHP config files, you can use a new end method to check in which environment is the application running. This syntax also works to define routes and services only in some environments. You can even combine all in a single file to configure some packages and create services, but only for some environments. The traditional way of using a config file per environment will keep working in the future, but it's encouraged you to give this new feature a try to reduce the number of config files to maintain, especially for minimalistic applications. I think the PHP unit bridge is very cool because it provides utilities to report legacy tests and usage of deprecated code. And it helps separating the dependencies of your app from those of PHP unit to prevent any unwanted constraints to apply. But if we want to use PHP unit extensions, you have to add it directly as a dependency to the main app composer.json. And now in Symfony 5.3, there's a new environment variable, Symfony PHP require, and that you can use to add packages to the PHP unit bridge installation without having to add them directly to the main app composer.json. Under the hood, it will execute a simple composer require with the given value. So if you downset a version, it will install the latest possible version, like in the first example. Or if you want, you can set a specific version, like in the second example. Or if you want, you can also add multiple packages, like in the third example. Also, a new PHP unit assertion was added, which checks the format of the HTTP response. For the comparison, it's using the predefined formats of the request class, the HTTP foundation component. I think most of you know the kernel test case. And there are at least 3 ways to get the container in the test class. At first, you can boot the kernel and get the container directly from the kernel object. At second, you can boot the kernel and use the static property container, which is in Symfony 5.3 now deprecated. At third, you can get the container from the client if you're using the browser kit component. Or the new fourth option is to use directly the static function get container. So under the hood, this new way will also boot your kernel if it's not already booted, and returns the test service container, which you should use basically in your tests. And if you forgot to activate the framework.test variable configuration to set to true, the test will throw in an exception. And as I mentioned, the static property container is now deprecated and will be removed in Symfony 6. Yeah, and also like Jan mentioned, there's even more. So this is only a collection that we thought it's important to announce. So have a look on the blog. In the last weeks, there are published some detailed news articles to the new features, and check the changelog and upgrade. MD. Yeah, Dennis will follow with the runtime component, which is new in Symfony 5.3. And also new is the password hasher component, which maybe will follow in another talk. We don't know.
All right. First of all, thank you,